So with everything going on, I wanted to talk about the left, how I really see them as being these days no better than the alt-right. And this thing is going to be off the cuff, raw, unscripted, and just what comes to mind. So if it's a little disjointed, sorry in advance. So recently we have had a horrible situation in the US with George Floyd, where, as is often the case with police brutality, and there is a racism issue there, a police officer monstrously suffocated someone to death. To call it brutality and overkill is an understatement. Um, was it race motivated? Maybe, maybe not. But we do know that there is an issue with police brutality in the US, and there are issues with racism, etc. Um, at the same time, we have a situation in Australia, which I'm sure people would be aware of, the Disability Royal Commission. Where we have a situation in Australia, as SBS pointed out, where someone with a disability will be the victim of abuse or violence at least once every 10 minutes. People with a disability are 2 to 3 times or more likely to be victims of sexual violence or domestic violence in this country. Those of us with a disability will overwhelmingly be the victims of child abuse growing up, which then makes us more vulnerable to that abuse. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare noted in 2007 that those of us with a significant disability have a 42% chance of being suicidal and an 18% chance of attempting suicide at least once. Yet, when you look at the left's narrative, what is the left's narrative in this situation with disability? Well, it's twofold, and I'm going to deal with each of these because I think that it is absolutely important to point out how deranged the left's Marxist approach to inequality is, and how it literally forces minorities practically at gunpoint to pick a side, to choose between supporting their cause and throwing someone else under a bus, or throwing themselves under a bus and helping another cause. Let's start with just simple abuse, for example. Let's narrow in on that for a minute. As people who are familiar with the left would be aware, when you look at their abuse policies, which are feminist driven, they are based on what are known as patriarchal dominance models. These models argue that all abuse is, quote unquote, a manifestation of the oppression of women and the product of male power, where women can only be victims and only males can be perpetrators. Now, if we extrapolate this out, just as an intermediary, just dealing with female perpetrated abuse against males, be it domestic violence, rape, pedophilia, or child abuse. The only party in female on male abuse which is capable of experiencing the oppression of women and matching the description of women can only be victims is the abuser. Likewise, the only party capable of possessing male power, and by the way, anyone who wants to argue, no, that's not what patriarchal means, actually, when you look up either a definition of patriarchy or patriarchal, it applies exclusively to male power, so that is exactly what it means, but I digress. In the cases of female on male abuse, the only party capable of possessing male power is the victim. Likewise, the only party capable of matching the description of males can only be perpetrators is the victim. So what you have in that situation is a situation where patriarchal dominance models can only respond to female on male abuse by blaming the victim and accusing the victim of oppressing them into oppressing their abusers into abusing them. which I'm sure we would all agree is massive victim blaming and massive domestic violence apologetics, rape apologetics, pedophile apologetics, and child abuse apologetics. And in fact, the only people that would ever argue that a victim made an abuser abuse them are abusers, enablers, and apologists. End of story. Now, of course, it gets even worse because those of us with a disability, as we are shown, as we see time and time again, with the number of us that have been terrorized into silence or locked in cages as a kid. Thank God that was never me, but I honestly think that with many of my abusers, that was only because a cage wasn't handy. But I digress. Because so many of us have been abused so badly, we know those of us with a disability have no real power. And so we've got no ability to actively oppress anyone. So if you're going to argue that we're oppressing anyone, then you're talking about passive oppression. In other words, our mere existence oppressed our abusers into abusing us. I mean, that's tantamount to saying that we deserve to be abused simply because we exist and calling us useless eaters. And for anyone who recognizes that rhetoric from the 1930s, yes, that is the rhetoric of a certain infamous political group with a four-letter name starting in N and ending in I. And yes, those beliefs and that persecution did wind up following on to leading into the massive brutalization and butchering of 5.8 million Jews. I digress. What you have in this situation, as someone who is a disabled survivor of decades of abuse, is a system that responds to disabled male victims of domestic violence by demonizing us, dismissing us, and trying to manipulate us into perpetrator programs. I wound up, while I was suffering domestic violence, experiencing a form of partner rape that was so egregious that when I described the details to a child sexual abuse survivor, they described what I disclosed to them as quote-unquote worse than rape. I'll leave you to fill in the gaps on those gory details. Yet, when I called up Men's Line, their response was to cherry-pick my abuse and try to manipulate me into a sex offender program. And in fact, when I sent them an email, I didn't get a response. I contacted them again, stayed on the phone demanding it, and then the woman I got on the phone was constantly shutting me down, and then doubling down on that very model. And then when I understandably got upset, had the gall to accuse me of being an abuser, and then claim that I was going to hurt those around me because I was understandably upset at someone treating me as a disability, someone with a disability who has been abused for, at this point still, the majority of their life, like a useless eater who deserve to be abused simply because they exist. And this is it too. In terms of the wider issue, those of us who are disabled male victims of female perpetrated abuse are put into a situation where either we have to support the notion or have to support this approach to abuse, where if we don't say that our mere existence is made us deserve to be abused by female perpetrators, then we must hate women. Then we must want to abuse women ourselves. And, that's tantamount to basically, to shut, say, a female rape victim down, of saying they must be a rapist because they want male rapists to be taken seriously. That's the kind of sickening situation that you get. And then you've got the larger issue with intersectionality itself. This stupid intersectional matrix of privilege points. With this whole idea of cishet white males can never be oppressed. Really? The only true privilege is wealth, for starters. Secondly, the people who are saying this clearly don't have a disability, or they clearly don't have a disability while being cishet, white, and male, because I can tell you that is a load of crap. Ableism doesn't give a rat's ass about how cisgendered you are, how heterosexual you are, how white and how male you are. I mean, seriously, I'm waiting for someone to tell me how being cishet, white, and male helps a 10-year-old boy on the autism spectrum who's locked in a cage by their teachers, and let's even say female teachers of color, because I'm sure it happens. I'm sure it happens. We already know female white teachers do it. I'm sure female teachers of color would do it. And some would even be on the LGBTIQ community as well. Because everyone can be bigots. Everyone can be ableist. I really want to know how being cishet, white, and male helps a 10-year-old white boy on the spectrum who is locked in a cage simply because they're autistic by their teachers, or how it's cishet white male privilege. I'll wait, and good luck proving it. But this is very much the problem with the left, and this is very much how they think. I've tried publicly speaking just calmly to political candidate campaign team members here in Canberra for, in the past during elections, and I have been held down with, "You're a white guy! You're a white guy!" Well, gee, I really would love to know how being white and male helped me in the situation. For example, when I was 14, I dislocated my foot in a family soccer game that went wrong, and I was basically told to sit there and shut up by relatives. Just one example of many how extended family members treated me like an uppity retard and uppity spastic. I'd really love to know how that helped me. Or when I've been told that disabled white males cannot be oppressed because, oh, get this, disabled white males benefit from misogyny and whiteness in ways that disabled women of colour don't. Piss off. Oh, and the best one? I was recently, a few months ago, in the Disability Royal Commission Action Group on Facebook, and taking issue with this rhetoric, and gee, I don't know, maybe because of that kind of stuff that I've brought up, that I have dealt with for years, I had a response of, I get you're angry if you have a disability, but if you are white and male, you will never be as far behind as a female. Are you frickin' kidding me? And yet when I brought it up, someone who runs that group, someone who claims to be so concerned for the Royal Commission because she has a son who is male, and judging by her name and her appearance, I'm guessing he's white. The response of that person was to put me in a situation where they made it clear that I either jumped or I was pushed out of the group. That's the reality we're dealing with, and you cannot tell me it is an exception, because of one thing Black Lives Matter does that makes me say, damn you all to hell, and that is this idiotic hashtag of disability to white. I'd really love to know how a situation with disability advocacy, where those of us with a disability who are abused by female perpetrators face a system that tells us straight off the bat and every single time that we deserve to be abused simply because we exist, where we're met with, "You're a white guy," when we try to speak out, when we're told that the abuse we experience, the ableism we've experienced, is just cishet white male privilege. Essentially where we're told, shut the hell up, you uppity retard of a patriarchal bleep lord who needs to check their privilege and stop pretending to know what real oppression is. I would really love to know how even daring to speak up when we are shut down constantly is disability being too white, about how it's disabled white males having too much of a voice. Apparently, we're just meant to shut the fuck up completely and take it because Black Lives Matter, while apparently the lives of uppity retards like me don't, simply because of what's between my legs and this, the color of my skin. Are you freaking kidding me? You know, to bring it full circle, these George Floyd protests, etc., it should be simple. Because what happened there sucks. If you are killing someone, falsely arresting someone, or harming someone because of the color of their skin, because of what's between their legs, because of the gender you identify with, and that they identify with, because of who they go to bed with, etc. Any of these things, religion, ethnicity, I'm pretty sure I covered race already, but any of these things, if you are hurting someone because of any arbitrary characteristic a person has, you're scum. End of story. If it's happening, it needs to stop. And if we all had empathy, it would be a no-brainer. But no, we can't have that. Instead, we have to have this idiotic Marxist zero-sum game where someone has to be an oppressor, someone has to be the oppressed, and it all has to go together in a set of privilege points which add up, and somehow your experience, even when, in the case of disabled white males, those of us with a disability here in Australia who are white and male are more likely to experience are as likely to experience discrimination as able-bodied women of colour, and that's based on the Australian Human Rights Council. So even though that's the case, these privilege points turn around and say, no, that can't happen because you're white, you're male, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm sorry, you narcissistic virtue-signaling modern-day Pharisee scumbags. Life doesn't care about your intersectional matrix. Life doesn't care about privilege points. And you are part of the problem. When you put a gun to minorities' heads, figuratively, or literally in terms of the system and cancel culture, and you say, choose between throwing yourself under the bus or throwing this other minority under the bus, then you are every bit as bad as a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. You are part of the problem. You are driving this bigotry. You are driving this tribalism that destroys empathy. And in cultures where empathy is devoid, bigotry thrives. When you push this pseudo-religious nutbaggery, this secular fanaticism, you're the very problem you claim that everyone else is. You're not helping, you're harming. And no matter how much you virtue signal, it won't change it. It doesn't make you the hero. It simply makes you the worst kind of villain. The kind of villain who genuinely believes they're a hero. And if you're on the left and you support cultural Marxism, you are a villain. You are a monster. And you are the modern face of bigotry. You are as much the modern face of bigotry as neo-Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan. And you should be ashamed of yourselves. Because the fact of the matter is, we are all human beings. And either you are contributing to a culture of empathy, where we all care about each other, where we care more about the content of people's character than the color of their skin, to quote Martin Luther King. Either you are on that side, a human being and an egalitarian, or you are a bigot, a monster, a sociopath, a narcissist, and a complete part of the problem and a villain. Make your choice, but understand that history doesn't forget. and that if you continue down that path, you will wind up on the wrong side of history. And you deserve to be, because everyone matters. And we need to be caring for each other and dealing with all systemic injustice, all bigotry, and it needs to happen regardless of how that fits with your particular brand of dogma and ideology. Until next time, folks, be kind to each other. You deserve it.